I'm a 20-year-old language student from Leicester, currently doing my year abroad in the Bordeaux in the south of France. I haven't made too many friends here, but the friends I have hold dear to me. A couple of weeks ago, we took a trip around the south, to my friend Clement's hometown of June. There are lots of beautiful little villages scattered around this part of the countryside, which are very peaceful, calm, and the people are very pleasant. This area is not an area that tourists typically visit, so the locals are often bemused to find a foreign person in this part of the country. Outside of June, there's a slightly larger village called Eugene-les-Bains. This was another very stunning part of the country that had a Michelin star restaurant that we decided to pay a visit here for my boyfriend Brad's birthday. He had taken time off work to come to France to visit me, and we were glad to be spending some time together again finally. We booked a table for 4 in the restaurant, for me, Brad, Clement, and his girlfriend Jeanette. Initially, we wanted to book into the restaurant's hotel as well. However, it was too expensive for students like us, so we booked into an Airbnb on the outskirts of town. We enjoyed a lovely meal, then sat outside drinking wine and smoking cigarettes in true French fashion. We then went for a late-night stroll through the town, enjoying the quaint little frog statues situated throughout. After we got too tired, we decided to head back to our Airbnb for the rest of the night before we headed off to our next destination. We eventually made it back and headed off to bed at around 1 a.m. I woke up at 3 a.m. to the sound of something scratching by the door or the window. I couldn't really tell which one. I wondered if it could have been a dog, or perhaps another small animal, like a cat maybe. However, the sounds faded away almost as quickly as they appeared, and I quickly drifted back off to sleep. Not long after, I was awoken again, not because of any sound from outside this time, but because Brad had gotten up for the bathroom. I lay back down on the pillow and closed my eyes, but then, a sudden sense of dread filled me up. I don't know how, but I had a feeling that someone was watching me. I looked around the room, and the moon was bringing in just enough light to see. I looked over to the window, which should have been closed via the shutter, but with Brad not being used to the life around here, he had forgotten to lock it. I could see it being slowly pulled open by a hand from the outside. Its silhouette was lit by the moonlight, attempting to open the window while holding something that I couldn't quite make out. I then heard what sounded like an old-fashioned camera shutter closing repeatedly. I hadn't heard one of those in many years, not since my grandfather would take family photos of us. But as I've heard this so many times in my life, it was unmistakable to me what that sound was. What felt like an eternity passed before I could bring myself to open my mouth and yell out to Brad. The person at the window quickly began to climb down, and whilst briefly in the moonlight, I caught a clear glimpse of a very distinctive ring on the left hand. I didn't get a long look at it, but it appeared to be wooden, with a distinct marking on the side. Seconds later, the assailant was gone. Brad rushed outside to try and see who it was, but all he saw was an empty street, and he could hear the sound of footsteps becoming more and more distant. We didn't sleep a wink the rest of the night. Neither of us dared to. We checked out of the Airbnb as early as we could once there was sunlight. Clement and Jeanette went to the car while me and Brad returned the keys to the lockbox. I messaged the host about what happened, and whilst he seemed sympathetic, he said he wouldn't be taking any action against what happened. A few days have passed, and we still have no idea who tried to break in. Brad thinks it might be the host, because he didn't seem too apologetic. However, Clement says that's just because he's a rich snob who doesn't care about foreigners, so we'll likely never figure out who it was. The creepiest thing for me is that some perv has a photo of me lying nude in bed, and I have absolutely no idea who has it, and whether or not it might end up online somewhere. So me, my boyfriend, and some friends all booked an Airbnb up at Big Bear Lake in California. The first night we stayed there, it was kind of creepy because the cabin was pretty remote, and of course there's absolutely no lights outside. We were in the woods with howling coyotes and bears, but nonetheless, completely normal activity. One night, around 12 a.m., my boyfriend and I are in bed, when suddenly our friend sleeping downstairs comes banging on the door, freaking out, saying he saw shadows in the woods, and that the motion light came on, and that there was thumping outside. We got a little freaked out, but my boyfriend gets out of bed and checks the entire cabin, and even goes outside. Nothing. We go up to all the other rooms, where there's a porch with a sliding glass door that looks out into the woods. It's important to note that I'm a very anxious and scared person, while my boyfriend is a rock. He is calm and logical, while I tend to jump to the worst case scenario. He goes over to check the last place in the cabin. He pulls the curtain, and then jumps and screams. He's a 180-pound CrossFit coach, and to see a big guy like that scared is nauseating. He locked the door and backed away slowly. He quietly says, "There's a large man standing outside staring at us. He's just standing in the woods, looking at us." At this point I thought he was messing with me, but then he looked at me and said, "Go lock the door." That's when I knew he was serious. Everyone was freaking out. I ran and locked the door behind us, and we all decided to stay in that room to keep an eye out. It was the middle of summer, and it was really hot, but we refused to open a window. About 30 minutes go by, and nothing happened. I started to get annoyed with the heat and the fact that there were 5 people in a tiny room, so my boyfriend and I just went back to our room. I was still pretty spooked, and he was trying to cheer me up. At this point it was about 1:30 a.m. I told him I was too scared to sleep with the lights off, and he told me that was fine and that he understood, so we just laid in bed with the lights completely on. Finally, I started drifting off to sleep when I heard a thud. I sat up, and then the power cut off. I immediately start sobbing. I'm trembling and I can't see anything because it's pitch black. I try to get out of bed and run, but my legs get tangled in the sheets and I fall. I get up, we grab our phones, and run to another room where everyone else was staying. I was hysterical. I tried to contact our host, but nothing would go through. I tried to call my dad, but all of our phones said no service. We were alone out there. Thankfully, one of my friends had a different carrier from the rest of us, and he had one singular bar. He called the local sheriff's office, and they transferred him to the utilities company. We gave them the address, and they told us we are too far in the woods, and they didn't cover that area. At this point, there were 2 scenarios that made sense. Either the entire area's power had gone out, or the man outside had cut our power. We called 911 and reported suspicious activity in a power outage. They sent the fire department. A few hours went by and it was 3 a.m., and suddenly the power came back on. We fell asleep, and the next day we talked to some locals in the area. We told them our power went out, and he said that was strange and that shouldn't have happened. He told us the only reason that happened here is because of a snowstorm, and he said he couldn't explain it. That means the man in the woods definitely cut our power. I don't know what his motivations were, but I never want to see him again. I'm going to be keeping some of these details vague, because I seriously don't want the Airbnb hosts to find out that I published this story. I don't think they would approve. I spent a year studying in Mexico recently, and as you do on an exchange, I tried to travel as much as I could. Between the semesters, there was a big break, and me and my buddy that I spent most of my time with during the exchange decided we'd go on a long backpacking trip through Mexico together. We had a rough plan on where to go and what we wanted to see, but we hadn't even booked our flight back yet, nor were we sure where we would take it from. We wanted to keep it flexible. We had an amazing time, and a few days before our trip ended, we finally decided we would take our flight from a city that was close and had really cheap flights, but the city itself didn't really have anything to offer. Then on Airbnb, we found a room very close to the airport in a house with a pool. We thought we would just treat ourselves with a nice relaxed pool day as our trip was coming to an end. So we booked the room. It turned out that the hosts were a family. The husband was Mexican, and the wife was from Europe and could even speak our native language. So we arranged that we would take a bus to the airport and that they would pick us up from there. But when we finally arrived in the city, it was already dark, and the bus driver refused to drive us to the airport since it wasn't directly in his route, so he just dropped us off on the highway. That was already a pretty crappy situation to begin with, standing with our backpacks on the side of the road in the middle of nowhere in a not-so-safe city in Mexico. But I called one of the hosts and sent them our GPS location, and they said no problem, they would come and get us. A while later, the husband arrived. It was a very uncomfortable situation getting into the car with this stranger in the middle of the night in the middle of nowhere. It also didn't help that the guy looked like Danny Trejo without a mustache, and as I tried to make small talk with him, he only gave monosyllabic answers or just straight out ignored me. I just thought he wasn't that big of a talker, and I hoped we would arrive soon. Looking back, I can see a million red flags, but for some reason, at the time, we just didn't see them. Either that, or we were just too tired, to be honest. But we didn't really have any choice but to go along with him. Looking back, when we arrived is what should have immediately set off alarm bells in my head. We were in the middle of nowhere. There were fields with sheep and goats all around, and all of a sudden, a gravel road branched off from the paved road, and along that gravel road, there was about 6 huge mansions, all with 2-meter walls around them, topped with NATO fence, huge gates, and at least 2 gigantic guard dogs per house. When we entered the house, we were greeted by the wife, a bubbly middle-aged woman that was very talkative but pleasant. She had actually cooked dinner for us, and we ate while exchanging small talk. The husband just sat at the table, not saying a single word. After dinner, we more or less went directly to bed because it had gotten late and we were tired from a long day. The next morning, we saw the weather was not that good, so we decided to go into town and see the few touristy things it had to offer instead of spending the day at the pool. When we came back, it was already dark. We decided to jump into the pool anyways to cool off because it was very hot and humid. The wife joined us at some point, and my friend made the mistake to ask how they were able to afford such a house, because the size of the house didn't really match the price range of any of the jobs they told us that they were doing. She deflected the question a bit, and said that her husband was very handy because he had grown up in the streets and basically built the house himself. We realized that this might not be the best topic of conversation, so we broke it off. That was the last day of our trip, and we had our flight back home early the next morning. We still had some weed left that we had bought on the trip, and we thought it would be nice to smoke one out since it was our last night. But as this was a family house and they had kids around, we thought it would be better to ask our hosts if they would mind. So later in the evening, we asked the wife if it would be okay if we smoked on the terrace, which for some reason she found quite amusing and started laughing. She shouted to her husband, who was lying on the couch watching TV, "My love, the boys asked if it would be okay if they smoked some weed. What do you think?" The husband just laughed, but we didn't get an answer. We looked at her with a dumbfounded expression, and she just told us to go ahead. So we went to the terrace and started smoking. Later they joined us, and we just had a chat. And this is where things started to get really messed up. For some reason, they started asking all sorts of questions about what we were smoking, where we got it, how much it was, who we got it from, and how much we would have to pay for that back in Europe. They just seemed way too interested in it, and at one point, the wife just nonchalantly revealed to us, "Yes, we thought about doing that as a source of income, selling weed, but too many people die doing that, because the cartels don't like it. Actually, my husband used to kill people for doing that." I immediately felt sober. Did she just say her husband killed people? And as if he read my mind, her husband added, "Yes, when I was about 16, I killed a lot of people for the cartel for money." He said it in a tone as if he had just said he used to mow lawns when he was a teenager. I still thought I must have misunderstood, so I texted my friend who was sitting across the table from me, trying not to make eye contact. He confirmed that I had indeed understood right. We discussed what we should do, and agreed that there's no immediate threat, and we should just stay. We don't have anywhere else to go, and it's already late. But then things got even crazier. We tried to keep our composure and not completely freak out while making conversation with our hosts. A few minutes later, though, the husband got up and went inside to get something, and he came back with a literal kilo of weed pressed into a brick. He proceeded to break bits off the brick and roll them into a joint that probably would have knocked out Snoop Dogg. It was about the size of my thumb, and I guessed it had about 2 grams of weed in there. Of course, he offered it to us, but we politely declined, saying that we were already pretty stoned. He seemed a little offended, but fortunately he bought our excuse, but it got even worse. A few minutes later, we heard a couple of loud bangs. The wife became a bit uneasy and asked what that was, to which he answered calmly, 9mm, which confirmed my suspicions that they had indeed been gunshots. I would say it was around 7 or something shots, fired pretty quickly one after the other. The wife got nervous and asked if maybe we should go inside, but the husband just shrugged it off, and we stayed outside. Again, a few minutes later, there were more shots, this time even closer. The wife got even more upset and asked to go inside again, and I think I will never forget what he answered in the calmest way imaginable. "No, everything's okay. I haven't heard any screams yet." I don't know why, but the way he just calmly said that freaked me out and still makes my heart beat whenever I think about it. After that, we quickly excused ourselves and went to our room. When we finally could talk, we basically both lost it and panicked. What were we supposed to do? We were locked in a house with a contract killer in the middle of absolutely nowhere, and people were shooting outside. We decided it was probably our best bet to stay. He probably wasn't going to harm us because we were his guests, and it was better to have walls and dogs and a serial killer in between us and the people shooting around outside. So we barricaded ourselves in the room and didn't sleep a second until the morning when we noped out of there and went to the airport. I was never so happy to be patted down at security in my whole life. This video contains 3 terrifying true stories that happened to people who were home alone. If you enjoyed this video, watch this one next.